I'm very nervous. And I know the expression normally goes that you're supposed to imagine people in their underwear, but that's actually not going to cut it, so here we go. My short story is called All Wars and Alone, and I dedicate it to Sir Hardin, who is a wonderful human being, but also to my comrades who went overseas and never really came back whole together, and also the ones that never came back at all. I was on leave for 5 days in Michigan for Christmas. I went to a cabin off the Great Lakes in the Upper Peninsula that belonged to some in-laws who were gone for the winter. The forest around the cabin ran uphill with a road coming through it and then turning into only a dirt path that took you to the cabins, spread out through the hills. You had to travel along 2 great hills to see another cabin across the river. My cabin had a short dry dock along the back of it. From the front, you could climb downhill to a fork and follow a trail further down and head up the road to the freeway. I took the trail and started through the hills toward the river. When the pines thinned up, you could see 2 docks beyond a small lot. There were 3 men sitting in chairs on the ice around a hole they had made for fishing. I kept on the trail and climbed the steep hill and started a rough walk down through the snow in the low-hanging pines. There was a paved road that ran between the hills that the game warden drove on. I walked on it because it was clear and easier to get through to the docks. When I got to the lot, I kept on towards the river and saw a cabin rising from the natural clearing. Along the river, the docks floated on the water. They were held together by 2 steel cables running through holes drilled into the wood. On the dry days, you could lie there on the docks and feel the weight from the boats passing through the thin waste of the river. The river later balloons out, and during the summer, you could hear the boats taking off to the far coast. When the hunters come for the winter, there is nothing but the sound of rifle fire carrying through from the hills. When they saw me on the dock, the 3 ice fishermen called me over. The oldest of them was Bill, and he was heavy, with a red beard and sorry, pathetic eyes, and he was drunk. The youngest was Sean, and he was tall and heavy in the stomach, with slim arms and legs and short brown hair. Then there was Jim, who was short and stocky, but good-looking, with a thin black beard and a pleasantly drunk face. Jim asked me, "Where are you staying?" "About a half mile that way," I said, pointing towards the hills. "You want a drink? Sean, grab the other chair," Bill said. "You just passed the fort?" Jim asked. I nodded, and he continued. "You know the people who own that cabin?" "My brother-in-law's family owns it." "Fine people." "Very fine," said Bill. Sean opened up another chair, and Bill poured us a brandy with eggnog. I sat and drank it slow while Bill finished his drink. His cheeks were so full of this stuff, it dripped through his heavy red beard and down his second chin. He went to wipe it away with the butt of his hand, and I knew he was very drunk. He seemed relieved after downing the rest of it. When he poured another, he stared at it pathetically. He gave it the same look my friends made overseas when they got letters from their girlfriends and wives saying they'd fallen in love with another man. A great deal of the time, my friends just pretend they never got the letter and they'd keep writing their girls. The girls would never write back, and then it got hard because they became pathetic and reckless. They usually die in battle soon after from their recklessness. When this girl finds out about his death, she might convince herself that she loved him all along, and that he died bravely and gloriously. And so is born the romance of death and war. I turned away from Bill, and the group looked away from him. Sean checked his bait and replaced it when he saw that it was gone. Jim was slimming away the cork that was chipping from the grip on the handle and pretending to be too drunk to see Bill as he was. I didn't mind Bill being drunk, but the others did. They minded it in a careful way. They watched him when he wasn't looking. I knew this sort of camaraderie, and I admired it. I was glad to be in the company of men who were capable of that. Bill drank straight eggnog. He wanted to sober up, but perhaps he saw us watching him. When Sean handed me a rod, I followed their lead. I set the bait and watched it struggle, and then sink admirably into the belly of the hook. I let the line into the water, and we all kept on fishing and turning our faces away from the wind coming over the us. There was a current pushing the line into the edge of the hole. Another shot was fired from the hills. On this side of the river, you could climb comfortably out of the water. On the far side, you had to go upstream past the bridge that connects the island to the mainland. Even with the river, frozen as it was, the hillside was too steep. There was 20 feet of wall before you reached the cliff that overlooked the river. You could see young pines growing from the steep hillside parallel to the river. The old pines clung to the hillside's edge until their weight uprooted them. They'd collapse into the river and leave a crater that would fill during the next good rain. "You hungry?" Bill asked Jim. "I can eat," Jim said. "Nick, you hungry?" Bill looked at me. I haven't eaten yet, except for the drinks. Good, then you've got room for Leslie's. You're going? I told him sure, that I hadn't gone into town yet. The mainland bridge was busy after the sun had gotten low and we were shaded behind the heavy, thick, green pines. I felt like I needed to move a little because my legs had hardened up by the cold. I stood up and Bill said, I had the same thought. You want another drink? I nodded and he stood to pour me one. I finished it quick and handed him the cup. He asked if I wanted one more before we headed into town and I told him no. When we packed our gear, we started up the hill and through the pines to the road. There were only the hard, dead pine needles beneath the snow. There was no brush to get through between the pines and there was a great deal of space between them. Jim had me carry the tackle box and the brandy. He gave Bill a serious look when he gave the brandy to me. We climbed through the hills comfortably and the road was getting busier. We warmed up in the car and followed the salt truck over the bridge to the town. When the road smoothed out, it carried on up the hill and then turned sharply right, and you would go up further until it flattened out and you could see the clearing for the road through the pines. When we got to the main road, it had been cleared and the snow was pressed into the tree line. We came into town and got out at the service station. The owner's name was Walt, and he was heavy, but well-built and a little short. He had sunspots on his neck and his face. The oil on his clothes had been rubbed dry and smeared in some places. He was filthy, but he had a clean mustache, and his eyes were remarkably blue and made you think him to be a clean man. Walt was from Texas, and we got to talking about it while we waited on the others to leave the restaurant. We saw Jim coming up, and he said, Well, Walt, what are you going to charge me to park here? He smiled big and said, Let me have something you caught, and we'll call it there. That's fair. You got plenty of king salmon? That's what I was hoping for. I want a fat one. I did too, Jim said, and he opened the cooler and took out a good-sized one and bagged it with some ice and brought it over. Walt smiled big again, and the corner of his eyes wrinkled up. He held the fish out and inspected it. He said goodbye to the both of us and then walked into the shop where Sean and Bill were huddled beneath the hood of a car talking to the owner. When Walt came up, he shoved him the fish, and Bill got sore because it was one of the ones he had caught. They said goodbye to Walt, and we started up the street. There was a man shoveling snow along the sidewalk. I thought about boot camp when we marched past the men shoveling snow and singing a work cadence. They wore thick black peacoats, a knitted watch cap, and a pair of gloves. The collar of their peacoat covered both sides of their face. They posed like prisoners, working the snow and watching the sergeant pass down the line. When he was far off, they dropped their shovel with one hand and rested on their knee. It was better to work through it, though, because when the wind came over the lake and hit you, it gave a numb ache in your forehead. If you stopped for too long, you would feel sluggish until you fainted. There's no coming back from that sort of cold. We passed a community bank and a restaurant. You could go between them and see some of the Salmon River and a green rail running along the edge of the lot where the cars were parked. There was a steep drop behind the rail, and then another 20 yards or so until you reached the river. The people that weren't fishing were sitting against the rail and watching the line of fishermen along the riverbank. Some of them were waist deep in the river with the ice fishing pants coming up to just below their shoulders. We passed a lot of them walking up the street with heavy coolers, and it took two of them to carry it to their truck. They crept up the street towards the Eagle Lodge, and there were people on the road the whole way, and no other cars were trying to pass. The cold sobered us up some, but most everyone we passed knew Jim or Bill, and they gave us drinks while we kept on the street that ran along the river. Leslie's a fine cook, and plenty of woman. Jim's got a thing for her, Bill said, and he finished his beer. You did too? 2 years ago, said Sean. I don't have a thing for her. She had one for me. I indulged her. Jim's gonna indulge her. He did one better, said Sean, and he continued. We don't have the money for dinner. Don't be vulgar, Sean, said Jim. He's gonna be vulgar if he's gonna be a soldier, Bill said. Sean's joining the military, I asked. I've got a ship out, Dave. I just have to swear in. He wants to be an American and an expatriate all at once. He says he'll be an American when his time is up, said Bill. I've heard of that. I made friends with a guy from Vietnam and some from the Philippines. Lots from the Philippines. Oh yeah? What are they doing now? Sean asked. Some of them are not doing at all. It's better enough to keep track. Oh. We climbed a slope street up to a bridge that ran along the road where the river cut through town. The crowd was huddled at the bridge watching the fishermen below them. It was shallower beneath the bridge and a little past it in both directions. The river curves here, but the fishermen broke up the ice and let it go downstream. The fishermen further down were wading deeper up to their waists like the fishermen who were on the south side where the town starts. Where the river turns, you could see a man crouching beneath the pines and looking into the river for a school of salmon. The poles fell like dominoes when the fish came. The man furthest down would see the fish coming and dip his pole, and the rest of them followed all the way down the line until it passed beneath the bridge and around the bend where the river dropped off into heavier waters where no one fished. When we started across the bridge, Sean ran ahead and talked to an old man standing behind a small grocery store. The old man opened his jacket and took out a flask. Sean took a long drink and handed it to him, and he did the same. The old man patted his shoulder, and Sean gave a short wave and came back with a face drawn in like he had smelled something bad. It's bourbon. Really not so good bourbon. Well, it serves you right for not sharing, said Bill. It really was bad, Bill. I don't even think you'd drink it. Well, now I've got to have it, he said, and he left us to talk to the old man. They talked for a moment before he handed Bill the flask. He took a long swig and gave it back. The old man laughed at Bill's face and drank a little and put it away. They shook hands, and he returned and said, "That's the worst bourbon I've ever had, and I've had Mexican bourbon. Have you ever had Mexican bourbon? They say it's made with horse urine. I'd rather drink the horse urine straight than take another shot of whatever that was." We laughed, and Bill said, "I need something to wash this down. Let's get to Leslie's." The road climbed a little, and then flattened out again. You could turn around and see over the pines where the river turns, and it goes off further north and straightens out again. We kept to the road and passed a group of Spaniards and two Englishmen standing in the doorway of a Chinese restaurant. The Englishmen spoke fine Spanish to them, and they were saying how many deer they'd gotten. The Spaniards seemed impressed. They looked remarkably young, probably 20 or so. The Spaniards waited till they left to curse them. Some of Jim's friends smiled drunk and handed us a beer when we walked by. "Have we got a place to hunt?" I asked. "I've got a blind across the bridge we're going to in the morning. It faces a nice clearing. We'll get something," said Bill. "Good. You can't hunt in Afghanistan. There's nothing but dogs. Loads of dogs. They're in the streets, just like this. There's so many. I've seen the kids stuff the dogs in bags and beat them to death. They'd crowd around the bag while one slung the dog over his shoulder and they'd beat it against the wall or the ground. They'd keep on until it wore them out and they'd give it up and the next kid had to go. I used to tell them to stop, but there's just so many of them." "Well, we're not going to get close enough to bag of deer anyway," said Bill. Sean and I were standing at the end, and he asked me, "You've seen that stuff with the dogs?" "Yeah. You don't realize you're seeing that sort of thing, though, until you don't see it anymore. I don't even think about it. If I saw that here, I don't know what I'd do. But that's what war does to you." Sean nodded and said, "What do you do?" "I'm a combat medic." "So a corpsman, then?" "That's right. Do you like it?" "I used to think I did. I've had enough of it." I finished my beer. "What's it like being a combat engineer?" "I used to know one. His name was Sam. He was wiry and vulgar, but he was a hell of a comrade." Sean turned a little pale, and he asked Jim if he could have something to drink. Jim took out a flask and handed it over. He took a long drink and spat on the ground and said, "I'm going to be one of those." "You're going to be like infantry without getting the credit for it." "Do you have any medals?" "Sure, yeah, I got loads of medals. 2 of some, even." "You don't like them?" "No." "You think you will someday?" "I hope not." Sean took another swig and handed it to Jim. His face tightened up and then it got loose and you could see the drunkenness coming in. I let him be and asked Jim where Leslie's was. "We're coming up on it." He pointed at the next street and said, "Down that way, it's right here." There was a row of houses huddled together. You could see the fire coming through the window and the chimneys rattling from the smoke going through them. You could see steeples of the houses the next street over because the roofs were dipped between them. All of them had tall, thin frames, but from the street you thought they were sticking their chests out at you. They were warding off the winter. Leslie's was just before the Catholic church thrown at the dead end of the street. We got on the sidewalk and passed a closed dress shop and a tavern. We were further away from the noise of the crowd now, and you could hear the rifle fire again coming in through the hills. The sun was nearly down, and it was sitting on the shoulder of the hills. Finally, we saw a big woman sitting on some steps at the end of the street. She smiled big with her eyes, but kept on with her cigarette. Jim got to her first, and he nearly picked her up when he hugged her. She kissed him once, and then held him at arm's length. She was heavy, with good, clean brown hair that settled on her shoulders, and she hid her teeth with a closed smile. She let go of Jim, and hugged the rest of them until she got to me. She looked me over and said, "Well, now you're going to have to fight me to get in bed, Jim. Look what you brought with you." I blushed a little, and she kept on. "How old are you?" I nearly forgot. I took a moment to remember. 21. That's a decent age and an indecent time, she said. Drinks. Drinks, Bill asked, and Sean rushed to the door and went behind the bar to grab the whiskey and the glasses. Jim was last in and Leslie stayed back to lock the door. We hung our coats and Jim got up to talk to Leslie near the fire going by the door that led to the kitchen. Sean had the shots poured before Jim came back to the table. Leslie disappeared into the kitchen. Do you like it here, Nick? Bill asked, and he poured another whiskey. I like it just fine, I said. That taste from the bourbon is gone, said Sean. Lucky you, Bill said, and he finished off another shot. You won't taste the food getting so far gone, Jim said. I'll be back soon, Bill said, grinning and pouring another. Leslie came to the door with a plate of red potatoes for everyone. The skin held onto the potato when you bit into it. The butter and the garlic bubbled out and dripped for the hanging end. I took the flat end where I had bitten into it and mopped up the sauce. When I got through the film of butter and garlic, I bit further into the potato and they came together, leaving the garlic on my tongue. I washed it down with a sip of whiskey and kept dipping the potato into the sauce pooling on my plate. Leslie came out when we were almost done with a few venison steaks. We need to get the hunting started if we're going to beat out the Brits, said Sean. It's not the Brits, it's the Spaniards, Jim said. They have the rich matadors. They are slow and fat, or they are very slim and quick. They live in the mountains. These hills are nothing. Even the slow fat ones have a good shot at taking down the game. The women, too, Bill added. Yes, the women, Jim said, and he continued. But I've got Leslie. Leslie blushed. You've got those bullfighter's eyes. You can't know to charge them or to let them come to you. It's witchcraft. Witchcraft? Aren't you a Catholic? Asked Bill. No one has time to be a Christian during the hunting season. You'll starve, Leslie said. I heard they serve crackers and wine, though, said Bill. They never have any wine. Father Cooper's an alcoholic. See, this is why I'm an atheist. I've got no problem with poaching another man's deer, said Bill. Or whiskey, said Jim, looking over the table at him. Bill gave him a hard look and said, the food will clear me up. Leslie had done all she could with the steaks. It was cheap meat with nothing to it. No one drank whiskey with the steak because the whiskey couldn't get into it and give it richness. I was relieved when I finished it and I could drink to satisfy, but the steak left hungry. I had a few more with a little lemon and felt warm and mellow. I smiled without meaning to. Bill cleared up after a time and things were better at the table. Leslie was sitting with us and the food was gone. The cafe was clear and the lights were off except for the ones over the table, and the stove was still going. Outside, the church bell started and rang 9 times. If you were quiet, you could still hear the hunters firing their rifles in the hills. The sound was low and heavy when they were deep in the low part of the hills. Sean asked me when my leave was up. In 2 days, I said. What do you do over there, Leslie asked. Nothing, really. We drive around a hell of a lot. What do you do, though? He's a medic, Sean said. Do you drag them away from battle when they get hurt like in the movies? Asked Bill. Sometimes, I said. I was starting to think hard on it when Leslie asked me if the people hated us over there. I told her no, and it was only some of the time it was truly bad. I told her it was much worse at the beginning of the war. They had the energy to fight then. Do you like your job? Not much anymore. It used to bother me a great deal, though, I said. Are a lot of them dead once you get to them, she asked. Not always. There are the ones that are alive that will be fine. Then there are the ones that are alive that could die, and the ones that are alive that certainly will die. What do you do for the ones that will die? She asked. Get the chaplain? That's sad, Jim said. Probably. I told him about a man I had brought in that was shot in the stomach. He was wheeled into a room with another man getting ready to die. The chaplain was standing over the other man, giving him his last rites. The man who had been shot screamed the whole time the chaplain was there. He was spitting blood and screaming for the chaplain to come over. The chaplain kept on with the last rites, holding the other man's hand. We tied the man down who had been shot because he tried to sit up and grab the chaplain. He was sobbing and screaming and bleeding. The man getting ready to die was crying and squeezing the chaplain's hand until he started trembling all over. He died a few minutes later and the chaplain left the room. The man who had been shot died a half hour later. I was sure that we had killed him because you cannot put a man in a room who could die with a man that certainly will die. Holy Christ, Bill said. He finished his whiskey. Did you know them? Leslie asked. No. What were their names? Their last names were Clark and Schultz. Did you go to their funeral? Yes, but they were buried with 50 other guys. The president came. Jesus, she said. It doesn't bother me. You're cold, Nick, Bill said. Too bad. I finished my drink. You're not sorry about it? She asked me. Plenty sorry, and then some. Enough to make the whole world sorry. Have you got anything to be sorry for? Never really thought about it. Neither have I. Jim stood up from the table and said finally, Can you drive, Sean? I've had 2 or so. You better get on, said Jim. I'll meet you all in the morning. Bill grinned at Jim and Leslie and stood up. We shuffled out of the booth and put on our jackets and stood at the doorway. Leslie said goodnight to the others and tried to apologize to me. I told her it was nothing, that I was drunk enough to probably forget it anyway. She laughed and hugged me. Jim stayed with Leslie and they locked the door as we started to waltz shop. There were still people in the street. They were grilling food near the bridge and drinking. The ones that knew us told us goodnight. The hunters and the fishermen had gone to the Eagle Lodge. Bill wanted to drink with them, but Sean wanted to get back. We saw some of them sitting on the porch and pointing into the darkness of the hills. We kept on and turned down the street for the houses. It was past 11 and there was no light coming through the windows. The rifles sounded less through the hills. Bill said, God damn it, I'll have to get started tonight if the Spaniards keep it up. Why don't you? Sean said. I'm not a goddamn cat, I can't see in the dark. You can stay out the blind though, maybe something will pass by, said Sean. Alright, but I'm taking something to drink. Walt's truck was gone from the shop. He got into the van and started back. The salt on the road had gotten into the ice and melted it. There were 2 clear lines we drove along back to the cabins. We turned off the trailhead and got out and started on the trail. There was a safety rope that began at the very bottom and ran uphill and split at the fork and kept going in both directions toward the cabins. The rope was twisted tight and had a hardened gel all through it. It kept it from getting brittle from the cold. When we got near the cabins, Bill turned off towards the blind. He asked me to meet him in the morning. I told him I would. He started down into the pines with a bottle of brandy coming out of his pocket. I packed my bag of fish with a little snow when I got to the cabin. I saw the embers through the window when I came up the stairs. Something ran out from beneath me and went off into the darkness. It was pouncing through the snow and catching in the low branches of the pines. I went inside and laid down. The room was spinning hard though, so I sat up for a while and read. I got the fire going again before I lied down. I thought about the time I had left for leave. I didn't want to go back to Afghanistan. I didn't want to go anywhere. I was comfortable there. I had a hell of a good leave. I lied there facing the fire and thought about killing a fine deer with Bill. I imagined it happening and I forgot about leaving, the war, and my dead friends. I slept hard until 8 or so. I started out after I ate a little and brought some eggnog for Bill. The trail following the dips between the hills seemed shorter than before. I suppose it was because I had walked them mostly drunk and serious walks and no good drunk. I enjoyed it much more sober. I went off the trail and took a shortcut through a clearing. I felt the dead pine needles breaking the soft, pleasant way they did. The pines closed in, so I got on the trail again and knew I was getting close to the fork where Bill had gotten off. You could see some of the red dirt darkening the snow at the base of the pines. I saw the trail climbing up, and then it was a steep walk down to the fork on the other side. The air was lighter during the day. The snow was loose and easy to get through. There were some deer tracks through the snow into the trees where the blind was. The trees had a wet pine smell, and they were holding up against the snow. I passed through a clearing and crossed over a frozen stream. I went uphill, and the snow was coming down hard. It was coming off the snow and blinding me. When I got to the peak of the hill, I saw another clearing and the blind just beyond it. I passed the clearing and I saw something coming out of the snow. When I got closer, I saw that it was Bill lying face down. I walked up on him and pulled him from the snow and studied his face. It had no color in it. He smelled like whiskey and death. I laid him down and covered him up. You could see his heavy cheeks coming through the jacket. He had coarse features. He shaved often enough to look lazy and worn. He was a little too heavy with unwashed hair. He might be unlikable, except that he was pathetic and you couldn't feel anything but sorry for him. When you're at war, It is a hard thing to know what a man is like by how he keeps himself, because you can be filthy and heroic all at once. Bill had his own war, though, and he surrendered it quietly and alone there in the clearing. I left Bill and started to climb up the shoulder of the hill until I saw the river through the pines at the base. I started towards the river, and you could see Sean's cabin on the other side facing the river. The front was cleared except for a nursery of pines growing along the trail that led to the porch. I reached the other side and walked along the bank in a steep wall overlooking the river. I climbed up where a stream cut through the cliff. The trail was just beyond it, and it turned down, and there was a long, flat wooden bridge over a stream. The hill was shifted over a little to make room for the trail along its belly. I saw the young pines and the cabin with the windows dark and nothing passing through them, so I kept on the trail until I met the road. I followed it a ways down towards Jim's cabin and the docks, walking with snow had been pushed out by the tires going through it. I thought about Bill and tried to work myself up. I couldn't, though. I couldn't get it going. I walked along trying to think of terrible and sad things, but Bill was dead and there was nothing to it for me. I didn't know what to think about it. I cared about him a great deal, and he was dead, and that's supposed to hurt, but it didn't. I thought about the first few friends I lost and how awful that really was, but I don't feel that anymore. I hadn't felt that in some time. I tried working myself up until the road opened up to a lot where the docks and the cleaning station were. Jim's cabin was just before the docks, following a short walk through a clearing that led to a spot by the river. Jim was watching the river, leaning on the fence that lined the porch and smoking a cigar. He had one hand still gloved with blood dotting the rail from gutting the fish. He looked me over and said, "Leslie got me cigars. How'd she get them?" He took a long draw and said, "I don't know, I didn't ask. She looked happy, I didn't." He gave the cigar a hard look and beat the ash from the end and put it out. "You want the rest?" he asked. I told him no. He said, "You gonna let Bill dress the deer? You'd have better luck getting a blind man with Parkinson's to do it right." I looked away from him and out onto the river. I saw a fisherman standing on the point of a small boat. He had his leg up and he was resting on it. He'd look over the reel and wind it a moment and then relax again. You knew when the fish got on because he pulled back hard suddenly and pointed the rod into the water to keep the line together. When the fish gave, he pulled hard again, and this kept on until the dance was done and the fisherman could net him. "Want to come inside?" he asked. I studied his face and said, "Bill's dead. We need to call somebody." His face thinned out instantly. He lost all his color. He looked like Bill had when I found him. After a time, he said, "What?" "Bill's dead. He was drunk and he fell asleep in the snow. He's dead and we need to call somebody." "What the hell are you talking about?" I didn't want to say it again. I asked if I could use his phone. He let me in and I called 911 and let them know where I found them. I asked Jim if he wanted to come with me. He started crying hard and he said over and over that there was a great deal of people that looked like Bill and it probably wasn't him. I told him I was sure, but he insisted I didn't know, and he got dressed and we started to walk back to the hunting line where Bill was. When we got close, we could hear the sheriff in the corner talking. Sean was standing halfway up the trail on the hill, and he didn't look at us when we walked up. When Jim saw Bill, he broke down. Sean grabbed onto him and held him for a long while. Jim's eyes and nose were red, and he was sobbing. He covered his face with his hands. Sean took him away after a time, and they returned to the cabin. I helped the coroner get him into the bag and onto the stretcher. We held onto the safety rope and climbed downhill to where he parked his van. Once we had him inside, he asked me how long I was staying. I told him I was leaving the next day because my leave time was up. He nodded and said he would talk to Jim in a few days. The sheriff followed him down the road, and the snow started coming down hard. I headed back along the trail and didn't see Jim or Sean again. They didn't come to say goodbye before I headed back to the base. I didn't think much of it, though. I flew back to Florida and waited for orders to deploy again. I realized I was comfortable in war. But when the war is over and you come home, it's no good to dwell on it. If you bring the war home with you, it makes people uncomfortable. You can celebrate a little, but to think hard on it and despair will make them misunderstand. You build a fleeting resilience to death. But after you've returned home and there is nothing to stop it, the man who had ignored his dead friends cannot help himself. He will drink and cry and remember them. There is no such thing as fortitude. For the whiskey, your dam stands over a dry riverbed. After you've had something to drink and a little time, your dam falls apart and there is nothing but the unnatural sadness that comes from finishing a war.
And that was Hardin Hofferek, and that was his first public reading, and I could cry right now. I'm just so touched that I met him and that he just